In over 70 years of the NBA draft, there have been some insane stories. From people becoming obese to avoid getting drafted by a team, to drafted players literally citing the will of God just to get traded, it seems like every draft there's some crazy story that appears and it makes sense. Getting drafted, and especially to the right situation, can change a player's life, change a team from poverty status to a legitimate organization, and even change the entire league. And with such high pressure and crazy stakes, it makes sense why there can be so many crazy situations. But out of all these situations, which one can be considered the craziest? Well, usually some of the crazy situations start off when players don't want to be drafted by a certain team. And while in the history of the NBA there have been many prospects who have done this, there were few situations as outrageous as Charles Barkley's situation.
So that's why we got to make sure the Sixers don't draft me down. So we went on a 2-day eating binge. I get on the scale, I'm like 302. I like 302.
Leading up to the 1984 NBA draft, Charles Barkley was one of the more confusing prospects. He was extremely athletic, was a bully in the post, and was a prolific rebounder. However, he was also considered very fat. In his college days, his nickname was literally the round mound of rebound, and this is because he played while weighing over 280 pounds. His weight was often a topic of discussion, and scouts would say that he could possibly be the best person in the draft if he just shed some weight. But over the course of his draft process, Charles did not lose weight, but he actually gained over 20 pounds. However, this wasn't due to some inherent laziness, it was because Barkley did not want to be drafted to a certain team, specifically the Philadelphia 76ers, and this was due to the team's salary cap issues. In 1984, the NBA for the first time had announced a salary cap in order to deal with financial problems plaguing the league. Because teams like the Sixers already had several high-profile players and were above the salary cap, they could only offer their first-round draft picks a maximum one-year $75,000 deal. When Barkley heard this situation, he said that, quote, "I didn't leave college for $75,000 and started to create a plan to get the Sixers to not draft him." In 48 hours, Barkley actually had to report for a pre-draft weigh-in for the Sixers, so he decided to go on a binge-eating bender. In just 48 hours, Barkley ate 2 Denny's Grand Slam meals, a vanilla milkshake, an entire KFC lunch meal with sides, half the Red Lobster menu, multiple McDonald's Filet-O-Fish sandwiches, a big steak dinner with desserts, and the entire time was drinking copious amounts of beer to wash it all down. Because of this, in the span of 48 hours, Barkley gained an insane 20 pounds and weighed in at over 300 pounds. At the day of the weigh-in, the owner of the Sixers, who ironically was an owner of a weight loss company, lost his mind, calling Barkley nuts, lazy, and fat. Because of this, Barkley thought that he was in the clear, but surprisingly, the owner, who still believed in Barkley's talent, ended up still drafting him. Even though what Barkley did was crazy, the owner believed in Barkley's talent and was still willing to risk a high draft pick on him. And while what Charles did was crazy, once he was drafted, he didn't try to fight it anymore and reported to the Sixers. However, there are definitely other prospects who even after being drafted cannot accept their situation, and this was the case for the crazy draft story of Steve Francis.
Don't forget to call your grandmother now from Vancouver.
I don't think that, it'll be hard for me to be myself. I just want to be happy, where I'm playing.
Coming up to the 1999 NBA draft, Steve Francis was a highly touted point guard coming out of the University of Maryland. Francis was ridiculously athletic, touted as the next Allen Iverson, and was even nicknamed Stevie Franchise before playing a single game. Steve Francis was a consensus top 3 pick, and every team would have loved to draft him. However, Francis did not feel the same way toward every team, and he especially was negative toward the Vancouver Grizzlies. Francis did not like the Grizzlies franchise and had many different reasons for this, from the franchise's far distance from his hometown to the higher Canadian taxes. And it didn't help that the Grizzlies were a struggling expansion team that had just gone 8-42. Because of this, before the draft, Francis and his agent even outright told the Grizzlies that they did not want to be drafted by them. And during workouts for the Grizzlies, according to various people that watched the workout, Francis seemed like he wasn't trying and that he potentially was even missing jumpers on purpose. However, even through all of this, the Grizzlies could not get over Francis's incredible potential and ended up drafting him anyway. And Francis was very publicly not pleased. During the broadcast of the draft, when Francis was drafted, the camera showed an incredibly displeased, borderline distressed Francis. He was not smiling, he had his hands on his head, and even seemed to be contemplating life. And in his immediate post-draft interview, Francis didn't even mention Vancouver once and seemed to be doing whatever he could to avoid talking about the franchise. However, after the draft, Francis did not hold back. Francis, over various interviews, reiterated how the situation in Vancouver was not for him, and at one point even stated that God's will was for him not to be in Vancouver. Francis's negativity kept building, and he reached an apparent tipping point when he and his entourage arrived in Vancouver and a random person asked them if they were rappers. After this, Francis and his agent officially asked Vancouver to trade him, and in an insane 11-person trade, the Grizzlies traded Francis to the Houston Rockets. And in the aftermath of the trade, Francis would go on to say that God didn't want him in Vancouver, and because he was traded, he knew that he was God's son. In Houston, Francis would go on to win Rookie of the Year and later on be selected to 3 All-Star teams. However, the Grizzlies did not receive a player of Francis' caliber in the trade and would go on to have a horrible season, and because of their continued lack of success, would later relocate to Memphis 2 years later. Because of this, many fans would blame Francis as the reason for the Vancouver Grizzlies' demise, and during his NBA career, he dealt with copious amounts of hate. However, while Francis's outward hate of the Grizzlies was crazy enough to affect an entire franchise, it wasn't as crazy as when a potential frozen envelope changed the methods of the entire league.
The commissioner gives a big exhale before he takes that card out of the hopper. And the Knicks ended up winning with Patrick Ewing.
Before the start of the 1985 NBA draft, the league had decided to introduce a new concept called the lottery. This lottery made it so that the draft order was not solely determined by team records, and instead made it so that all 7 teams that did not reach the playoffs would have a shot at the coveted number 1 pick. And in 1985, the number 1 pick was unanimously predicted to be Georgetown star center Patrick Ewing. Ewing was a prospect that was seen as a franchise changer, and everyone and their mother wanted him on their team. Now, before this lottery had been put in place, the team with the worst record, which was Golden State, would have gotten Ewing. However, on the day of the draft lottery, the big winner was instead one of the NBA's most marketable teams, the New York Knicks. And when the Knicks won the lottery, many people called foul. This was because while the Knicks were one of the NBA's most popular franchises, they had just gone through a terrible losing season, holding the 2nd worst record in the NBA. Because of this, people thought the league had purposely rigged the lottery in order to help make the Knicks good again, and by doing so, raise the viewer ratings of the league. Alongside this theory came speculation on how the league had rigged the draft. When this draft happened, it wasn't like modern day drafts where everything was determined by lottery balls behind closed doors and with constant surveillance. When this draft happened, a bunch of envelopes containing team names were dropped into a clear spinning drum, and the commissioner would handpick the envelope. Because of this, people thought of many different theories. One of the more popular theories was that when the envelopes were being put into the drum, while most of the envelopes were treated with care, observers noticed one envelope, supposedly the Knicks one, being tossed in with force, hitting the drum and creasing the envelope's corner. Because of this, people theorized that the commissioner, David Stern, would feel around for this creased corner and would know which one to select, guaranteeing the Knicks the first pick. Another popular theory was that the league had actually chilled the Knicks envelope prior to the drawing, and by doing this would allow Stern to feel for the cold envelope and pull it out first. And while all these theories can be explained, and there was never any hard evidence to prove them, this didn't matter as people even to this day swear that the draft was rigged. And because of the fan outcry and perception toward the 1985 lottery, the league actually changed how the lottery was done to combat the negative perception fans had of the lottery. To this day, the NBA lottery draw is monitored by independent auditors, team representatives, and recorded on video, with the league even releasing a detailed report of the drawing sequence after. However, even with all this, the 1985 lottery left its mark, and whenever something crazy happens in modern day lotteries, fans will accuse the league of rigging. However, while this crazy conspiracy theory ended up changing the perception of the league and forced the NBA to change the method of their lottery system, it doesn't compare to when one of the league's most impactful players was supposedly traded for an ice skating show. Leading up to the 1956 NBA draft, Boston Celtics coach Red Auerbach had his sights set on drafting USF star center Bill Russell. Bill Russell was a defensive stalwart, leading his team to back-to-back NCAA championships and even winning 55 consecutive games. However, because of these high accolades, Russell was projected to be a high draft pick, and the Celtics, being a playoff team, did not have a high pick in the draft. But Auerbach was not deterred by this, and through various negotiations and trades was able to eventually draft Bill Russell. However, the negotiations supposedly didn't involve normal trade materials such as players and money. Initially, Auerbach was able to get the number 2 spot in the draft by trading away some of his established players. However, in order to get Russell, the situation required Rochester, who owned the number 1 pick, to pass on Russell. And for some reason, on draft night, Rochester ended up picking a guard named Cy Green instead, leaving the door open for the Celtics to select Russell. According to reports, Rochester didn't pick Russell because they already had strong frontcourt depth and the owner worried about being able to afford Russell's contract. However, while this seemed like a legitimate reason, years later, rumors started to show up as to the real reason why Rochester passed on Russell. According to these rumors, Celtics owner Walter Brown, who was part owner of the popular touring Ice Capades ice skating show, struck a secret deal with Rochester owner Les Harrison. This deal was that Brown would promise Harrison a week's worth of Ice Capade shows at Rochester's arena if Harrison would pass on Russell in the draft. This would mean that Harrison would basically receive a sizable amount of revenue from the show, and in exchange, the Celtics would get their coveted prospect. Now overall, this rumor seemed just like that, a rumor, as there was never any hard evidence that this deal took place, and both owners denied that this deal ever happened. However, people still came to believe that this rumor actually occurred, and that was because it was started by various Celtics legends such as Tommy Heinsohn and Red Auerbach. In various interviews and books, these legends brought up and confirmed the story, even stating things like Russell was the only NBA player in history to be traded for the Ice Capades. Because of this, fans and various media outlets reported on this rumor and made it into a lore that fans still spout as the truth. And if it's actually true that Bill Russell, one of the greatest NBA players of all time, was traded for ice skating shows, that's probably the craziest NBA draft story of all time.
Even though I, Sir Charles, have been telling you that Weight Watchers has helped me lose 42 pounds and counting, and I can still eat man food.